Good evening and welcome to our Oxford Minds Social Sciences lecture. Tonight's lecture is the fourth and the final one for this term of our lecture series. My name is Dr. Susan James-Relly. I'm the Associate Head for Education in the Social Sciences Division and co-convener of this series with Dr. Alexander Betts, who is the Associate Head for Graduate and Research Training. Really delighted to welcome you here tonight. We've got an excellent speaker, so it's going to be very exciting. For those of you who haven't attended our lectures before, the idea for these lectures came about because of the pandemic, and we know that things aren't normal, but we wanted to show you what social sciences is and can be. And so we came up with the idea for a lecture series followed by a panel discussion and then the breakout groups on different topics that Oxford Minds, but to bring the great Oxford minds together. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Alex, who will introduce our speaker for this evening. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Susan. So this week and next week, we're tackling the theme of protection. And protection is a word, like most of the words we've adopted for the series, which evokes lots of connotations. It can be thought of in the context of social protection, human rights, or armed conflict. But perhaps the space in which it's most used and most critically engaged with is humanitarianism. And really thinking critically about what humanitarian protection means is particularly important at the current juncture. Even before COVID-19, we were seeing dramatic changes in the nature of armed conflict, the nature of disasters and crisis, particularly in the context of environmental change and natural disaster. And today, particularly with COVID-19 and its legacy, there's a need for us to rethink what protection means, particularly in a humanitarian context. And there's no one, I think, better placed to offer some reflections on this than Dr. Hugo Slim. Hugo is someone I've known for a very long time as a scholar practitioner, someone who has two of the sort of strongest feet in both the academic side of thinking about humanitarianism and the realm of policy and practice, and bridges the two very effectively. Hugo is Senior Fellow at the Blavatnik School of Government and has been since the start of this academic year. He works mainly within the Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict, ELAC, that does fantastic work on really critically thinking about humanitarianism from a range of perspectives. But most recently before that, for the previous 5 years, Hugo was head of policy and humanitarian diplomacy at the International Committee of the Red Cross. So really at the coalface of policy and political debates around humanitarianism and protection. Hugo is also author of one of the most influential works on the ethics and morality relating to humanitarianism, entitled Humanitarian Ethics, A Guide to the Morality of Aid in War and Disaster. And if you haven't already read it, I'd highly commend it to you. So Hugo, thank you so much for making time. We know how in demand you are, and we really look forward to hearing from you. So the floor is all yours.
Alex, thank you very much for such a warm welcome, and Susan, thank you too very much. It's a real pleasure to be part of this series and to be talking as part of Oxford Minds. Protect is such an instinctive word. We know what it means, and we can imagine it very easily. Thinking about a child, protecting a child, or someone we love, protecting them, putting our arms around them, pulling them away from danger, keeping them safe in some way. And we can imagine it too, protecting something valuable, a precious heirloom, a precious thing we've inherited from family that tells us about our history, and keeping that safe. And of course, we can imagine very easily protecting ourselves, because we're highly trained to do that instinctively and intuitively. And of course, we're all hoping very much to protect ourselves in the next few months from COVID with the vaccination that I'll be having, the Oxford one, I hope, the Oxford vaccination, and any other vaccination that may well protect us, protect ourselves. And so protection has a preventive element to it, preventing harm, and it has a restorative element too, to restore a person to their natural dignity and integrity if they've experienced a harm. We take them to us after something terrible has happened, and we try and comfort and protect them from the implications of that. So protection should be, and it is really, a simple idea. And my focus, as Alex has said, this evening is going to be on people's protection in war. And so I'm thinking really largely about civilians, the non-combatants in war, protecting civilian people. And I'm also thinking about those, in the French phrase, who are hors de combat, who are out of the war as combatants and are now prisoners or wounded and sick in some way. So these are the people that humanitarian protection in armed conflict is concerned about. And the humanitarian practice, I'm also going to talk about the humanitarian practice that has grown up and expanded enormously, which describes itself, as we know, as protection and sometimes as humanitarian protection in armed conflict, in war. And I'll try and do three things in the next half hour or so. Give us all a bit of history about, in a sense, where this tradition of protection comes from, its origins and its ancestors. And then secondly, I'll try and describe protection today, quite probably a thin description of it, its scope and ambition, its operational character on the ground, and its operational grammar. I'll explain that later, but the way it thinks about the subjects and objects of protection. And I'll also talk about its financing. And then finally, thirdly, I'll try and put forward 3 or 4 ideas about protection's future, this field of practice, where I think it might usefully move on to. And I hope in that respect to talk about protection rediscovering its simplicity and its limits, and perhaps really combining and joining up with its new cousin, social protection, which is growing apace, particularly since the COVID crisis. And getting ready to work in the increasing disasters from climate-related risks that are going to affect our world in the years to come. And in a funny way, coming from the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement recently, if the last 20 years have been the sort of high point in the sense of the International Committee of the Red Cross with an agenda around conflict and war, it seems likely to me that the next 10, 20 years may well be the high point for the International Federation of the Red Cross with its focus on disasters and climate and those new challenges. So, a few bits of historical roots. Where does this protection field, this practice, this tradition come from? I think it's fairly clear, probably, certainly in the European tradition, that modern humanitarian protection and its movement has its ancestry in 18th and 19th century humanitarian reformers. So I'm thinking of early human rights workers like Voltaire and his great campaign around the Calas affair on finally ending the practice of torture to force confessions from usually innocent people accused of crimes wrongly. I'm thinking of the great Thomas Clarkson, the Quaker, who led and shaped the campaign to end slavery and protect slaves. And I'm thinking in the Industrial Revolution of Lord Shaftesbury and Engels working hard to understand the conditions of the new working classes in industrial Britain and then bringing law and reform into place to protect them, child labour, men, women. And more internationally, I'm thinking of the tradition of Roger Casement, the great diplomat, activist, and then Irish nationalist, who really uncovered colonial crimes in Congo and Peru and really, in a sense, developed the field of international protection work for those affected by those crimes. So this tradition had at its heart as a practice the discovery of human wrongs and people living beyond the protection on dignity of a good life. And it would then discover those, document them, advocate and campaign to stop them, and principally by incorporating forms of protection in law and new laws to make sure those activities, those those ways of living and working never happened again. And so finally developing legal protection and then reporting on it. And I think that is the basic tradition where humanitarian protection comes from. And so humanitarian protection, as it's operated in armed conflicts and wars and disasters and around refugees today, is really in that law-based protection model. And that model then, out of social, industrial, colonial crimes, was then innovated into war, the context of war. And then we have great work in the Hague with the Hague Conventions, Geneva and International Committee of the Red Cross around the Geneva Conventions. And then finally, after World War II, we get the Refugee Convention. So this tradition of human rights practice, if you like, of protecting people who are being badly treated in the world, is then internationalized even further in the many human rights conventions that follow in the second part of the 20th century. And in a sense, that is a major effort, if you like, to domesticate the international in laws of protection somehow. So if that's the ancestry and origin, what we have from that is that tradition introduces into war a juridical cultural practice that is vested in legal protections, protections in law, responsibility under law, and compliance with law. And in a sense, in the war frame, it's civilians who are both in situ in a conflict and in flight from a conflict, and combatants who have legal protections and protections covering them in law. And it is this mystical word that protection workers always use, authorities and combatants who have responsibility under those laws to protect those various communities, and so to comply with those laws. And a lot of protection practice is sort of theorized and operationalized around that dynamic of lawful protection and responsibility to ensure that protection. And much of it is geared around trying to ensure behavioral change so that those with duties to implement those laws and protect refugees, protect civilians, protect prisoners and detainees change and actually do it. In the process, of course, the building of this field and this very juridical cultural practice introduced lots of lawyers and quasi-lawyers into the humanitarian field, who have since become what we might call protection specialists. So that's a bit of a sort of distant history and the ancestry of the field of practice. What about recent humanitarian history? And I think we must here talk about the rise, the dramatic rise of protection in the last 20, 30 years. In my career, and I started in 1985, in my career, there's probably been 3 really big fields of humanitarian innovation and growth and expansion. One is gender, the other is cash, most recently, and the other is protection, these fields which have really grown. And I think the other one that's going to emerge now is social protection, which I'll come back to. But in 1985, when I was working tragically actually with Tigrayans crossing from Ethiopia as they are today, we weren't humanitarians. We didn't call ourselves humanitarians in the Anglo-Saxon or US tradition. We were relief workers. And protection wasn't something we did. It wasn't a term we used. Protection was something that we heard that only really ICRC, UNHCR did, and then a bit later UNICEF did, because they had this mysterious thing called a mandate. In other words, they were institutions linked directly to a convention or conventions of some kind. So the Refugee Convention, the Laws of War for ICRC, and then after 89, the Convention on the Rights of the Child for UNICEF. So we understood those mandated agencies as doing protection, but we kind of didn't. And that then changed very rapidly in the months, the years that followed. And I always remember we all started writing about it and thinking about it. And there was a sort of democratization of mandates that followed, where we all said, well, these laws are for everyone. They're not just owned by ICRC or UNHCR. We all need to work to these laws in the same way and do protection. And it's been a big shift. So there was an embrace by the much larger, non-mandated, if you like, NGO community, donor governments as well, to embrace this legal form of protection and this legal model of protection and relief. And it started really being spurred by the tragedies of Bosnia, the war in former Yugoslavia, where it was so obvious that people would have food, but they couldn't be safe. And then, of course, into West Africa, and then the tragedy of the Rwandan genocide and the war that flowed into Congo. And protection then became a very important thing. And humanity, the relief world, the emergency world, reinvented itself more along these sort of mandated Swiss Geneva lines of ICRC and UNHCR, and developed a humanitarian charter which identified with these laws and talked then, like ICRC and UNHCR had done, about protection and assistance, and so entered into this difficult dualism that has dogged the field since. In 1996, some of you may remember, but we were sort of all gathered together by ICRC in Geneva, who I think were keen to convene and control where protection went. And so we all began to work around that. And ICRC were very effective in sort of instilling their approach to protection on the wider sector. And then as the years went on, the sphere standards began to mainstream protection. And then, of course, in 2013, the Interagency Standing Committee, the IASC, took protection very seriously and decided that the humanitarian system should be protection-centered. In a way, that was the high point in 2013. And it was a high point of the funding for protection too, really, in proportionate terms. And then the next big date we have to remember, of course, is 2017 with the sexual abuse scandals, when in fact it became clear that people needed protecting from the protectors as well, as sexual abuse exploitation was exposed, and now also racism in the sector. People need protecting from the inherent racism in some of the big institutions and the structural approach and gaze of the sector. So that's really a bit of recent history about how protection arose. And so today we have a protection cluster chaired by UNHCR with more than 1,000 protection actors, as they're called, organized down 4 main strands of child protection, gender-based violence, land and housing rights, and mine action. And they are in the business of accompanying, assisting, and advocating for people's protection. And their mission as protection is to help people access their rights to be safe from violence, exploitation, and abuse. So if that's the rise of protection, how it all sort of took off and became apparently so successful as a new field of humanitarian action and so central, perhaps I should now turn and describe it in action a little. And I'm going to look at its scope, its operational character, its grammar, and its funding. And I'm going to have a glass of bit of water first. So if we think of the scope of protection, this is something that's always struck me as rather extraordinary. I think it's extraordinarily broad and hugely ambitious in its range of rights it's trying to protect. It is really very much and deliberately an all rights framework, protecting people, ensuring that they are able to access and realize their rights across every field of social, economic, political, cultural, not even cultural rights in many ways. And this is strange because we would think that in war particularly, we should focus on the core part of prevention and protection, which is preventing physical harm, bodily destruction, bodily attack on people and the destruction of their homes and worlds. So this focus on the physical integrity, protecting people's physical bodily integrity from attack, killing, wounding, sexual violence, rape, abduction, forced displacement. We might imagine that this is the core and basic human need that is most concerning to humanitarians. But actually, really from the mid-90s on, it turns out that this is not the case, and it becomes very obvious when you look at protection's track record through wars, that in fact protection is at its weakest here in the challenge of protecting people from physical harm and unlawful, devastating attacks on their person and their homes. In truth, protection seldom stops violence, atrocities, and displacements. If we're honest, law and protection does not protect. In the big strategic moments of violence that shape wars. So if we look at Syria, if we look at Syria's endless series of bombardments by artillery and air power, if we look at the thousands and thousands of people in detention who were never seen, never reached by protection, and died, starved, tortured, disappeared. If we look in the same way in Nigeria and Yemen and the Central African Republic, and if we look at Rakhine today, where the Muslim minority, the Rohingya people, have been utterly unprotected and persecuted for so long, we have to recognize that protection hits a dead end pretty quickly on the really big strategic challenge of protecting large numbers of people from large-scale violence. So what seems to have happened to protection is it then seems to have moved to work on the margins of this big strategic violence, to work more on the places in which people end up, like IDP camps or parts of the city that are unplanned and more like slums, and in difficult places or as refugees, on the margins after these big violent events which really change people's lives and end so many people's lives. I think if we were also looking at protection's track record, we'd look at access, and we'd look at recent reports, by the excellent humanitarian outcomes, who are trying to look at where access is possible and it's not. And we'd have to say that the data suggests that protection doesn't really strategically protect either, because typically humanitarian protectors probably have about 50% access at best in a conflict to where people are really suffering. And it's very seldom access to where the violence is highest and when the violence is highest. So in a sense, we're talking here about a failure in strategic threat protection, the conduct of hostilities. Protection doesn't seem to work well there. It seems to work better, not on strategic threat protection, but really on everyday threats, which is a phrase that Emily Padden, who's at Oxford for many years, and others are using, everyday threats, and Calibas's micro-violence within these civil wars. And that context is in fact closer to chronic poverty than war. So when protection is protecting in these contexts, it's doing things like trying to secure access to land tenure and land rights and homes for displaced people. It's trying to reduce chronic gender-based violence for men, women, girls, boys. It's trying to reduce and stop people trafficking from very poor communities using negative coping and becoming exploited by protection rackets of other kinds in these situations. It's trying to prevent early marriage a lot today as a coping strategy in the Middle East. It's trying to protect people against ordinary crimes of murder, rape, pillage. And it's trying to enable people's rights to basic public goods like education, health services, and water infrastructure. It's trying to increasingly do data protection for people so that their phones can't somehow lead them into discrimination or targeting in some way. And it's trying to do prison improvements and family tracing. So this, it seems to me, is more on the margins of the major strategic violence and more in the nature of the everyday threats and risks of chronic poverty, which so many people fall into because of war. And their method is still, the protection method is, in a sense, mixing advocating for policy changes. So we get land tenure changes or prison improvements or early marriage increasingly stopped and not happening, and individual casework. So many protection people do work on policy changes at a strategic level, but also on individual casework. So women and men who have been sexually abused or raped, disabled people struggling to get access to various services, and these individual caseloads which take up a lot of time and are hugely important to people's lives. But in a sense, it seems to me that that kind of protection is not really what people expect when humanitarian agencies talk about protection in war and from war. It's not really a use of the word that the public and investors, donors think about when they think about protection in war. I now want to think about the character, the operational character. And if I think about the way protection specialists, protection teams work, many of them long hours trying to understand a situation, talking in detail about individual people's lives, and then working with authorities to try and change the situation. The character of most protection work is very formal and bureaucratic. It's not radical and activist. And it works in a very statist and legalistic mindset between the state as duty bearer and the civilian as a sort of citizen, a rights holder, a civilian or a refugee or a migrant these days. So protection work is operating as an intermediary between the citizen and the state. And of course it does this in many situations, either within a state or under rebel governance, in which either the state doesn't care about people's protection and these laws and rules and demands and démarches, or they do care, but they cannot implement their recommendations because they've either got no really effective government or no money. So that, I think, is possibly the operational character of protection work. What about this question of operational grammar? And I use this phrase quite a lot about humanitarian work. I think protection work has also suffered from the subject confusion that damages so much of humanitarian work. If you like, it's been dominated by the egotism of humanitarian agencies rather than the subjectivity of people who need protection. And it goes back to an early question that Andrew Bonwick, who worked so hard on protection early on in the 2000s and then became a solicitor, where he's probably protected a lot of people, he posed this question early on: who really protects civilians? And I think, as so often, agencies thought they must protect civilians. They were the subject of protection work. They were doing protection activities to and with and on people as objects of their protection, of agency protection. But of course, one of the important things that's happened in protection in the last 10, 15 years is this discovery, which of course is no discovery to people living in war, that most people protect themselves and are determinedly doing that 24 hours every day. So thanks to lots of good field work by Oxfam and some very good academic work by people like Kaplan and Padden and Baines and Naomi Pendle, looking very detailed in parts of Uganda and South Sudan and other places, Colombia, there has been an important discovery of civilian self-protection. This fact that civilians protect themselves. And this has, I think, gone a great way to taking some of the egotism out of humanitarian protection work and reframing the grammar, if you like, that civilians are the subject of their own protection and agencies must work with them and enable their protection strategies. And in brief, civilians protect themselves, as scholars would describe it, in a couple of main ways. First of all, they have to work out how they engage with warring parties around them, coming through their towns and villages, dominating their space, setting up governance or alternative governance around them. And, you know, we're thinking of all sorts of armed groups and governments who are usually, more often than not, a problem for civilians. So they have strategies of deception to deceive them about their loyalties and say, yeah, we're fine with you, and then turn the face of the other lot and say, yeah, we're fine with you. They have strategies of avoidance and flight, so they can avoid being close to these people. And they have strategies of accommodation and negotiation, where they reach a sort of rapport and functioning contract with people who are threatening them in some way. And then the second way they can do all this, of course, they can protect themselves by acts of active resistance, either non-violent resistance to form peace movements very courageously, or armed violence, where they form militias to protect themselves and protect their communities. So it's very well understood now that civilians protect themselves. And that must be the case for so many civilians who are in the 50% of the worst part of a war, where humanitarian agencies just don't get to. So the challenge now is self-protection. And it is now achieving a critical mass in the protection mindset that, agencies are not the protectors. They must enable the protection strategies of civilians in some way. So they really work symbiotically with them to help them in what they're already doing and not disrupt it or blow it in some way. So that's been an important shift. I now want to look at support for protection, and in truth, it's going down. So there was a good Norwegian Refugee Council report last week by Damien Lilly and others, looking at the financing of protection. And although the high point in 2013, the international humanitarian community and many of its invested governments wanted the humanitarian system and its approach to be centered on protection, the money is not going that way. And humanitarian investors are not prioritizing protection. In the 2020 appeal this year, when the UN have done their new appeal today, but a year ago when they were appealing, since that time, only 24% of the appeal for protection finance has been met. So 24%. So then Western investors are not prioritizing protection. And in the survey from the NRC report, 61% of donors and others interviewed said they weren't prioritizing protection because it's not life-saving. And they compared it to food and water and shelter and said it doesn't save lives. They also said they could see no real demonstrated results from protection. 61% of people said that too. And 50% of those interviewed by NRC said that protection as it is today lacks conceptual clarity. So protection has a problem with its financiers. And protection specialists are not particularly popular at the moment, especially at a time when budgets are being cut, reorganized and relocated in a sense towards the huge economic recession and climate risks that are coming our way. So that's, I hope, some sort of legitimate description of the origins of protection, how it plays out today, how it operates. I'm going to try and think now a bit about protection's future. And so if I start with my 4 conclusions, the first one is that protection's track record is weak on strategic violence risks. So it doesn't really protect people against the massive violence that shapes their lives, causes them to flee, kills them, destroys their homes, etc. So it's weak on strategic violence risks. Secondly, it is developing an all rights framework. It wants to work on every single right a person has to try and help them realize all their rights. And therefore, it's developing a practice and a caseload and a focus that's more around skills on everyday threats to people's rights and lives, more akin to chronic poverty. And thirdly, we can conclude that it is turning to self-protection. So it is in a way becoming a more enlightened approach to protection, working with the people that need that protection and not pretending that it is the protector. And fourthly, we have to conclude that humanitarian Western government donors are not funding it very much. They're not prioritizing it. So just to end, what should protection do then to change its future at this point? What might we do to make the most of this field that has developed in the last 20 years? If we look at what it could do about big violence protection, protecting those people from aerial bombardment, massacre, atrocity, endless detention, I suppose I would say that one option they could try is to get more radical and to work in solidarity with people much more, and therefore to abandon humanitarian principles and to take sides more explicitly. Now, this isn't going to happen for the mandated organizations like the ICRC and the UNHCR and UNICEF, and nor should it. But many other organizations, of those 1,000 actors, need not stick to humanitarian principles, particularly if they are so obviously not working on strategic protection. And it's possible that these organizations working in solidarity could engage much more directly on rescue, helping people to get out of situations, actually not being neutral and going in and trying to work with them, or being there already because they're part of that community, and working on rescue with people to help people flee, to give people early warning of what's coming, and to support their resistance in some way, both physically, with material and support of food and health and jobs, but also digitally in the way that they can support them with a sort of digital protection ring of some kind. So one option is to move away from the principled humanitarian approach to protection of the last 20 years and recapture, develop a new 21st century practice of more radical solidarity and rescue and support to resistance. Secondly, I think the sector would really benefit from a simpler, more honest description of what they're doing. Because in some ways, you know, from what I've said, the term protection in war is publicly misleading, because of course we see this dissonance between asking for money for protection and then people's lives and homes being destroyed by huge breaches of international humanitarian law and other human rights. So if protection is publicly misleading as a term, I think protection agencies and protection people should be much clearer about what they actually do and what they actually don't do and can't do. And they should be much better at showing the results of what they could do and what they can do. And then thirdly, I think I mentioned social protection earlier on. This is, you know, the new big approach that is emerging, in a sense, from British social welfare, not British, but global social welfare, Western social welfare, to provide social protection systems. And of course, it's been pioneered and excelled in parts of Ethiopia and other parts of the world. So this looks, in a post-COVID era, like the new big way that a lot of people want to invest. And it seems to me that humanitarian protectors and protection agencies and specialists should, in a sense, be a bit less sensational about what they're trying to do in war and work and combine much more closely with social protection funds, initiatives, workers, and see themselves much more as social protection. And this seems to me particularly important for an age of economic recession, climate disasters, and this layering of risk that everyone observes, that you may be living in poverty, and then you may be living in a war, and then you'll have disasters happening around you from climate risks and disease and pandemics. So this layering of risk requires a very broad social protection. And in some ways, a lot of what is protection today is social protection, if we describe it more honestly. And fourthly, this importance of working with people's self-protection must be maintained. And there's a phrase from social work, and it's, you know, I've been in Britain again for a bit, so I've been looking at things here, from the British Social Care Act, emphasizes the value of co-production in protection, social services, etc. And I think protection agencies and protection people should take on this idea of co-production much more explicitly. So they're not working on people to protect people, but they're working with them. So they are doing protection assessments with them. They are co-designing programs with them, and they're co-delivering and co-evaluating programs with the people that need protection. So this idea of co-production, I think, should be formally and importantly part of the way protection practice describes itself and works. So I'm going to stop there. So I've tried to give a bit of history. I've tried to give a description, a general description of how protection works. And I've tried to point out some weaknesses and make some recommendations. Thank you.
Hugo, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. I hope the audience are going to start typing in their questions, but I might, take co-chair's prerogative and ask one. I was really struck by your four concluding remarks, particularly the first one. That protection agencies have been weak in sort of a strategy vision. But wouldn't that, to a certain extent, involve them having, a magic ball that they could see where there were going to be the big issues? How would we reconcile that kind of vision with what actually happens on the ground?
So I think you're right. I think it is difficult to see where attacks are coming from, who's planning what. But actually, one of the things that the protection community's learned is that they can understand a lot about a context. They can sort of predict seasons of, raids and what tends to happen, and they can have early warning. They can see what's coming. And things often repeat themselves. People trying to flee across borders and being blocked, as perhaps they are now at the Sudanese-Ethiopian border. They can see these things and perhaps plan around them. So I think it is possible in that way to become much more determined to, and I mean this, that not every organization may want to be a humanitarian principled organization. So they may want to work much more as part of that community under threat, part of that society under threat, and try and rescue it, adapt it, move with it, and shelter it in different ways.
Hugo, I think you've actually really demystified protection for all of us. I think protection is one of those areas that, for people who are not involved in humanitarian practice, it seems a very complex, quite convoluted term often. So I think you've given us a lot of transparency around it. I want to ask you about how you see the role of law. So when you spoke about the operational character of protection, you emphasized that a real focus is on everyday threats rather than what you called strategic threats. And you highlighted in a way that the character of protection is to sit between states and citizens, or between armed actors playing the function of the state and citizens. And those states are often either unwilling or unable to provide this broad gamut of social protection. You also highlighted historically that protection has emerged in a very legalistic context. So what I'm wondering is law the most effective way to achieve the delivery of that spectrum of solidarist social protection? Or are the barriers to it far more political? Are they policy oriented? Have we overdone and overemphasized the role of law? And is it overly accentuated by organizations within and beyond the UN system? Should we be thinking about this as a political realm that is inherently political and being open and honest about that? And how do you see the future salience or relevance of law within that re-envisaged vision for protection?
Yeah, it's a great question, Alex. You sort of put your finger on it, and obviously there is a place for law, and we must want law to work because those are all internationally agreed laws, and they're morally right in my view, and important. But the truth is, you're right. Law is not what has traction in most of these places. It may be with a few armed forces when they're not fighting for their lives but fighting a counterinsurgency. Then law may have a place for them because it's convenient and helps them seem reasonable. But in fact, as I said in the talk, in many, many big situations, law doesn't work, and people are not working to law. as the point you made. They're actually working on their political priorities. A lot of them think that for the nature of their crisis, the laws are now irrelevant because their need to win is so much more important than those laws. Otherwise, they'll be wiped out, or someone will win power, or whatever. So I think they're not always working with it. So there is a strong reason for others to work politically as well and organize politically rather than legally against those kind of forces.
Hugo, in your talk, you mentioned that funding is becoming less and less. Donors aren't funding protection, and Jane in the comments has said donors and humanitarian agencies often separate humanitarian assistance and protection. Could you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, why is it that we're seeing less money from donors, particularly for protection?
Well, I think I can only quote back what I saw in the NRC report. I think most of them are not convinced that A, it works, that B, it's addressing the big challenges of protection, like stopping people being bombed and killed and whatever. It doesn't seem to work there. And they're not going to prioritize, what we would think are very important things, perhaps like, land tenure and protecting certain groups and discrimination issues over food, water, which in a sense they feel gives them more bang for their buck in return on investment and is what the public expects their money to be doing somehow in a way. So I think that is a major challenge, and that's why there's a reluctance, I think, from what I've seen and read. I think Jane's point that humanitarian organizations and donors have this dualism I talked about, split protection and assistance. I think that is a real tragedy, and it's partly split in culture too. So if you work in a place like the ICRC or UNHCR, you'll find that the sort of aristocracy in the house are protection people. The lawyers, the terribly learned, they're working on the real sharp edge of where people are putting reports together, whatever. And then the sort of blue collar serfs are the food people and the water people and that sort of thing. And they've made this split culturally, which has not been helpful inside their houses. And it's not been helpful to donors to be given a protection budget appeal and an assistance one. And of course, it's not what happens in people's lives. And that's why I think social protection is a much more realistic, encompassing term, because in fact, a great way to be protected is to have some food. Food is protected. And there's been a big attempt to mainstream, as Jane will know, protection across the sphere standards, across everything, so you don't talk about two different things. But the cultures and the departmental divisions and the difference in mindset between a lawyer and a water person have prevented that.
Hugo, we've got a number of questions relating to your emphasis on civilian self-protection. And you were very optimistic about CSP, both its potential, but also, I thought to some extent, the reception of it by humanitarian organizations. And we've got a couple of audience questions that relate to that. One is from Paul, and he asks, do you see the move towards the co-production of protection as in tension with critiques of humanitarianism as being paternalistic and leaning towards implementing universal one-size-fits-all protection solutions such as child-friendly space? So I suppose the question is, do you see actually co-production as in tension with those critiques around paternalism and one-size-fits-all? Or is it, I suppose, implicitly still trying to work within that overarching, more traditionalist framework?
Well, it's a great question, Paul. I think co-production, if it's working well, should be the opposite of paternalism, because it actually should be an equal partnership where people are, it's this whole jargon that people want to use, people-centered, so it's the people who are the experts on their own conditions, that are able to say what they need and want and shape a better program. Now that must be right in many ways, and good co-production might mean that instead of an agency just turning up and saying, right, we've got to have health, we've got to have child-friendly spaces, we've got to have this, people might say, we don't want child-friendly spaces, et cetera, and we want something else. So what do we want to keep our children safe, and what want them out? help us get them out of here, or help them rescue somebody, who knows, we want to leave. So I think co-production would really throw open that question of what people really want, and I hope it would be the opposite of sort of path-dependent budgeting of humanitarian agencies, where they have a set repertoire which they turn up and deliver.
And you're quite optimistic about it. So, I mean, you mentioned the academic literature. You were very clear on the emergence of the theme of civilian self-protection, particularly in the context of internal armed conflict. Now, there's also different manifestations of civilian self-protection within the social protection context. Examples of mutual aid, organizations being run by displaced populations, etc. But it strikes me that many of them are sort of locked out of the mainstream humanitarian system, that they're not equal partners in applying for funding. They often fly below the radar and don't get recognized, and that many big organizations would rather the donor money went to them. Many governments providing taxpayer money are often wary about putting that funding into the hands of civilians or people who might have connections to armed actors, rather than larger international NGOs or UN agencies. Do you see a sea change in terms of the willingness of organizations within or beyond the UN system to open up to forms of civilian self-protection, particularly in the social protection space? Or what do you think needs to happen to facilitate that kind of embrace of CSP?
Yeah, so the first thing to say is that I'm optimistic. I think I have an optimistic face or something. People always say I'm optimistic. I mean, I'm actually trying to be objective, but I think the first thing to say, of course, I'm not saying that civilian self-protection is a panacea and this is the one, and that'll be fine, because it's quite obvious that millions of civilians don't and can't protect themselves, and they end up dead and hurt and harmed and homeless and poorer. And even in the the methods they choose to protect themselves, like fleeing, leaves them much poorer and puts them in a terrible place. Okay, so civilian self-protection is not a panacea. It's not, we just all do that because it works. It doesn't work in a sense any better, probably, in quantitative terms than other forms of protection. But I do agree with you that there are lots of other models and actors and agencies out there, and mutual aid, that should be given much more space and much more voice and power. And this is the whole question about, decolonizing the aid system, which is so important at the moment. And I think, COVID may have done us all a favor there. It's hard to tell at the moment, but I think the fact that so many internationals have had to go remote has, I think, given more space for local national actors, mutual aid groups to emerge, to come of age, to come of power. But the truth is, I think, that you have to watch a system, and the system will probably try and self-correct itself after COVID to continue as it was. So the big institutions, the big powers, will want to keep it going and keep that path dependency on the way that they get lots of money from donors. And then really making them change is going to be tough from within. And I think what will need to happen is a lot of those new organizations that have risen up with this emergency, in the way that there are new organizations that rise up with every emergency, as the great powers of humanitarianism today, that Save the Children, the Oxfams, the ICRCs, grew up in their emergencies, those young and new forms of humanitarian action and protection need to take power. It won't be given to them, actually. They'll have to take it.
Hugo, there's a question here from David who says, thanks for the thoughtful and very helpful presentation. But he asks the question, what do you think are the implications for the safety of principled aid workers, particularly domestic aid workers, if the humanitarian field is joined by other humanitarian actors who have abandoned humanitarian principles? He says a white ICRC Land Cruiser and the white Land Cruiser of these new organisations may be indistinguishable for belligerence. Should we move to a colour coding system like Dirk Salomons has proposed? Different signals for different types of humanitarian actors, would that help?
Yeah, I take this point about risk to life, but I mean, I think if you're in the business of solidarity and the kind of political solidarity that Alex was talking about earlier, you're not naturally in the game of protecting yourself with emblems and logos and things, and you probably won't be in a white Toyota, actually, because you'll definitely get caught and hit if you're in a white Toyota. So I think you'll find that there'll be different patterns of work, as there were in wars always before the 90s, in a sense. There were people doing much more covert, partisan type humanitarian action to rescue, to support resistance. And I think that's probably what more people may end up having to do. And I also think, in the climate context, I think it's not going to work that well, sort of trying to be principled and neutral and impartial about working in climate risks and disasters. I think you need to be really part of that society and that community to build structures of mitigation and adaptation from within that. It's not going to work a sort of exogenous model. So I think a lot of these groups that are emerging from COVID and will emerge around climate risk will be from within those societies and part of their struggle to resist climate shocks and adapt to new lives.
And picking up on that, there's a question from the audience that really asks, how can you rescue if you don't have access? And how can you have access if you're not neutral, impartial, and independent? And I think that's a really interesting question that picks up your conclusions in a way. You provided an alternative vision of humanitarianism as rescue, as solidarity. Let's be more honest about what humanitarianism actually does. It's about social protection. It's often about picking the sides of the weak rather than pretending we stand in the middle with no preference for the weak or the strong. But I suppose the access question that's pointed out there is key. Are the humanitarian principles playing a valuable operational function in ensuring the legitimacy that leads to the access? And I suppose I'd add a question to that about your conclusion as well, which is, what would your alternative vision require of the humanitarian practitioner of the 21st century? So if the principles are less structured, less rigorous, less historically grounded, isn't it making greater demands of the kind of virtue, character, and competence of the humanitarian actor and practitioner?
Yeah. So thank you. I think it was David the question was from, I'm not sure. I'm not binary about this. I'm not saying that, one way is better than the other. I'm saying, I think it's incredibly important that we keep those sort of key institutions, like ICRC and the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement and UN agencies that have that identity and that desire to operate impartially and neutrally and move between. And sometimes they can and sometimes they can't. So, principles are not, as if you work in Rakhine or Syria or any, Yemen parts of the world, it's not a passe-partout anyway to have principles. You can't go everywhere and do whatever you want. So access is always a problem for both models. I'm just saying that, there may be other ways that, as I've said in articles before, you can be humanitarian, you can support people, but that alternative vision, what's that humanitarian practitioner? They're probably much more in the mold of your mutual aid person. And they're probably much more now trying to, work out how to move people through the border from Tigray to Sudan if they really want to get there and need to get there. And they're not going to be the kind of humanitarian practitioner we are used to and have spent so much time trying to format and formalize and legitimize in the last 20, 30 years. So I think there will be different models, and I think there should be.
Hugo, I think I would certainly agree with that. We're coming to a close. I wondered if you wanted to make any closing statements based on the wide variety of comments that we've had. You don't have to, of course. Well,
I just want to thank you all and thank people for listening. And I do expect to get good constructive criticism for this, because I'm not right. I don't know everything. I don't work in protection every day of my life. So my description may well be inaccurate or have holes in it. And I think it's just important that we discuss this and we don't go on myth making and shrouding in the sort of obscurity of what protection is, but it's very important, and we shouldn't discuss what it is so much because it must be at the center of things. I think we have to think hard about what protection means in the 21st century.
Hugo, on behalf of all of us, a massive thank you for making the time, sharing your thoughts, your ideas. I think you've pulled off something quite remarkable, which is to offer something that is both very accessible to people who are coming to this area perhaps for the first time, but also something rich, insightful and visionary. I mean, as someone who has worked on protection for a long time, I felt challenged, engaged, and like you were presenting a lot of very original and thoughtful material. So I think to get that balance is a great achievement. And I look forward to continuing the conversation with you on everything that you've presented, and to us being able to share the lecture more widely with others who may not have been able to attend. So a massive thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.